Thank you for watching that. This is now the DVD extras bit where I spin out the model that I've made of Glastonbury Abbey Church by telling you a bit more about the history of the Abbey, how I made my recreation of the church, and compare it with the buildings that I've pinched bits from in order to make it look a little bit more authentic and real. Now, I should say that this reconstruction is just a little bit of fun on my part, and largely because after 4 years of messing about in Blender, I actually feel a bit more confident of being able to make things from scratch. And we've got all of this lovely data ripped from the big G. Why not do something with it, really? So if you want to see proper archaeologically informed stuff, particularly of the early churches that were in the nave here, the first built under West Saxon King Ine around 700, and then the major rebuilding under the energetic monastic reformer St Dunstan, who was abbot in the 10th century, go to these project pages on the University of Reading's website. They don't do much about reimagining the Great Church, though. There's just one image of it in the background, which is copied off an earlier established model, so I wanted to have a go at it, really. Reading also have reconstructions of the Vetusta Ecclesia, which is a timber church that was on the site of the Lady Chapel here, and obviously did not stand much chance in the Great Fire of 1184, which presaged the whole building of the Abbey Church. Writing around 1130, the monk William of Malmesbury called it, along other things, the Lignea Basilica, and he seems to describe it as made of brushwood wattle, so that's just really sticks bound together, but then later cased in planks and covered with a lead roof in the early 7th century. The lore of Glastonbury Abbey itself, certainly established in the 14th century, but they probably thought it earlier before, that they were founded by Joseph of Arimathea in 63 AD. Yes, this guy here, who is helping down the body of Jesus Christ, and he gives him his marble tomb to be buried in, somehow managed to get to Somerset to found a monastery. To say the least, I think other communities were probably just polite about this. William of Malmesbury puts in a bit about how the wooden old church, it's old enough to have been built by the hands of disciples of Christ itself, I suppose. But he was sincere in thinking that the monastery was founded 166 AD. And the old church genuinely being the oldest church building that he knew of in all of England. Now, whether in reality the abbey was established early 6th century or at the latest when it gets its charters in the 670s, it certainly had adequate prestige behind it when it was claiming such an ancient foundation. So when William was here, so the wooden church would have been here, behind it would have been a post-conquest rebuilding after the Norman conquest. Probably firstly started shortly after the massively unpopular Norman abbot was thrust upon the community in 1078, but then enlarged quite a bit after 1100. But the general layout of it, so where the crossing was, the length of the nave and the dimensions of the aisles, was broadly similar to the standing ruins. And that's why we don't know as much about it, because most of the walls have been dug out for the replacements after the Great Fire of 1184. So after, it was the 24th of May 1184 that the whole church burnt down. The replacement of the wooden church was consecrated on the 11th of June 1186, so finished in just over 2 years, although there was some stuff left to do. It was ready for using in less than 2 years. The ornament on it is very elaborate, but intentionally out of date. Backward-looking, old-fashioned Romanesque ornament. And it's only about a generation out of date, but it's a strong flex that makes an impression even today, making the building look older than it is. And that's a common theme for a lot of the church at Glastonbury Abbey. So at the same time that they were rebuilding this, the Abbey Church was rebuilt from the East End. And this post-1184 church is the one that I'm interested in trying to rebuild. So let's have a look how I rebuilt it. So first, the wireframe massing. Now initially I did this for a project I've been working on for a while now, of comparing the volumes of great churches and cathedrals accurately. But I've been having so much trouble working out a procedural way to actually measure volume, I decided in a sense it would be more fun to actually try and texture it and make it look like a real G-Earth model so it can be comped into a scene convincingly. Now making it, as I've said, is really pretty straightforward because there's so much of the site left. You've got the aisle walls to full height and you've got the transepts up to clerestory elevation that lays it out pretty well. It's not very difficult. And then you've got just add a noise texture for the masonry. I mean, at this sort of level, you could put a proper ashlar pattern on it, but for my purposes, I'm not really sure if there's a point. I mean, has this got a real ashlar pattern that you can actually see on it? Not that G is captured, really. And you've got a nice stolen texture added for the aisle roofs. And you can see I used two. When you start to look at it, you'll see where they're stolen from, really. But I think they look pretty good. But the thing is making it look like a G-Earth model. So I've got baked in darker shadow textures on this side as well. Then adding in, to make it look more like it is actually in G-Earth, rather than trying to build stuff from scratch if you've already got it, why not just duplicate what you've got? I can just copy that chunk, move it up, clean it up, and then you've got the rest of the aisle wall. Job done. For the choir wall, I actually did cheat a little bit. That is actually just the inside, because the thing about G-Earth models, the north side in shadow, particularly towards the bottom, ends up in a sort of big soup of shadows and you can't really see anything, so it works fine. And like a lot of this is all blocked by trees, so you know there's no point putting effort into stuff you can't see. And then I chose to add in the fenestration rather than try and actually map it on as textures. They're just floating planes that don't cast shadows, so you can match them up with the bay divisions pretty well. And if I turn off the wireframe stuff, it looks weird because they're all floating, but you can see that the actual clerestory window on the surviving elevations of the transepts does match up pretty well anyway. But then you've got the fun bit, and that is adding in what I like to call the cannibalized elements. So the advantage of nicking bits of other churches which actually exist is that it does make the model look a lot more convincing as a real building within the G-Earth environs. It also saves actually doing the modelling myself. I did do a little bit on the buttresses. I should have done more really, but this is more fun as well, isn't it? So let's bring in the first building which I used as a source. Wells Cathedral. Now just to say first, everything I'm going to bring in is from a big source file I've got, but I've double checked everything to make sure that these are exactly the right scale within the Glastonbury environs. This is genuinely how big Wells Cathedral is. Surprisingly quite small, on the smaller end, but not the smallest English medieval cathedral. So, you might be able to spot which bits I've stolen off the bat, but borrowing from Wells is an obvious thing to do for Glastonbury because they are so close. Well, not this close, obviously. They're about 5 miles apart, which means they use the same quarry, Doulting. The masonry is the same colour, which is quite important for getting away with stealing bits of them. They're also similar in date. We all remember the big date for Glastonbury's rebuild, 1184. Wells is almost exactly a decade earlier, probably built around 1175. But in their rebuilds, they were setting out to achieve quite different things with their architecture. And also, they were pretty big rivals who wouldn't really want to signal allegiance to each other through similarities in architecture. Now, you've got other sort of friendlier rivalries between great cathedrals and abbeys. You've got Christchurch Cathedral and St Augustine's in Canterbury, St Paul's and Westminster Abbey across London, but this is a rather more fraught and acrimonious one, and it's quite complicated, but I'll try and go into it. Wells was the original Cathedral of Somerset. It was where the bishop sat. But for various reasons, the Normans, after the conquest, moved the seat to Bath Abbey. This was in 1088. And it wasn't until much later that there was an idea that the seat would move back to Wells, and that this new cathedral was built on a completely fresh site, away from the older buildings, probably as a gambit at the very least anticipating the return of the seat of the bishop, under Bishop Reginald Fitzjocelyn after he became bishop in 1174. However, his successor, Saverick Fitzgeldwyn, largely for his own reasons, after he was confirmed as Bishop of Bath in 1192, he tried to annex Glastonbury to the see and reform the community at the abbey into a cathedral priory, something that the monks were not happy with at all. Now, this went on for a long time, even after Saverick's time, and it wasn't settled until 1218. And during the period, all through the first couple of decades of the 13th century, no one was really sure which one of these buildings would be the cathedral, but they kept building them nonetheless. They were going to be something. But being built on a completely fresh site, it doesn't have to worry about connecting to any old buildings or retaining anything. Wells is trying to do quite a different thing. It's being like, oh, look at me. I'm so fancy and new and gothic. I might not be so big, but look, I've got western aisles on my transepts. I've got towers outside of the aisles. Oh, how can I not be the new cathedral? But then you've got Glastonbury, which didn't really want to be rebuilt at all. It was lamenting the loss of the older church. So it's trying to look older than it actually is. And that's why when I started building this, I did steal the clerestory windows and put them in here. But I ended up painting the tracery out so you can't tell. Because I kind of think that Glastonbury wouldn't want to perp up its windows in the same way that Wells ended up doing. I could be wrong. You know, that's all part of the fun. At this point, I'll just pop off Wells and just point out that compared to Wells, my south transept is very, very boring. I've just put 2 clerestory windows in. Now, this is because, and why in the video I do the zoom out, is because I'm assuming that the dormitory was up against it. Glastonbury is an abbey. It has a community of monks who are using the church 8 times a day, including in the middle of the night, for their divine office. So you've got this dormitory block and the night stair as close to the church as possible. And usually, but not always with abbeys, you do have the dormitory right up against. And if it's demolished, you either have a big scar where the gable was, or the Victorians come along and clean it up. So that's why, compared to Wells, I have put no effort into the south transept at all. The other thing I've stolen from Wells, but you'll never notice, is the north porch. Glastonbury definitely had a north porch. It was actually probably bigger than this, but it's behind trees, so I couldn't be bothered putting any effort into it. I think that's fair enough, isn't it? But I'm sure you've noticed that the big thing that I've pinched from Wells is the choir extension. So you'll see in the video that this is the choir extension at Glastonbury that was built under Abbot Monington. So sometime between when he started being abbot in 1342 and when he died in 1375. The new superstructure and choir extension at Wells was before that. It was built from about 1320 to 1340. And you'll notice that I'm not the first one to have stolen the Wells Choir extension. And in fact, I took inspiration to steal it from the model that I've shown already, that you see when you go into the visitor centre at Glastonbury, that I believe was made in the mid-1970s by Nicholas J.W. Gaffney. It's a great model, gives you a great idea, and so much that it's clearly Reading copied it for their great church that you see in the background of their project images. But you'll see that they have 3 bays of dropped aisle roofs and big windows, and I've only got 2. Well, if we look at my photographs from a very wet day at Wells, you can see easier the stylistic breaks between the work, and that the aisle windows, so by the ground, sans the tracery, ignore that, it's all inserted, up to bay 4 are the original ones, as built in the 1170s. But in the clerestory, they're only the original windows up to bay 3. This is because bay 3 is the end of the high roof, and bay 4 was, in the 1170s, the ambulatory aisle behind it. Inside, so this is looking west towards the crossing, you can see the junction on the arcades between the new bays and the 1170s ones, which have a remodelled second story. The transverse arcade holding up the gable of the high roof would have come out from behind the bishop's throne canopy there. Simply put, the east end of Wells was increased from 3 high bays plus an ambulatory to 6 high bays plus a retro choir behind, while Glastonbury was extended from 4 high bays to 6. Now, I suppose it's not impossible that Glastonbury replaced one of their arcades in order to match Wells' half old and half new. But we have one important description, and that is by John Leyland in his itineraries from the 1520s and 30s. Now, John Leyland isn't a great appreciator of architecture, and for the great lost abbeys that he often saw shortly before their demolition, he's only really usually dependable for the monuments that you see inside the tombs and things. However, one thing that he can do is tell the difference between modern perpendicular style and old stuff. So here's the text from his description. There would be 6 goodly windows in the top of each side of the east part of the church. He's being really pedantic here, isn't he? He's telling us windows on both sides of the building. Very interesting. But there were 4 of old time, since 2 added, and the presbytery elongated by Walter Monington. So, that's pretty clear, isn't it? He looks up, he sees 4 windows that look old, and 2 that look big and new. So hence, I rather hastily did. I did do an earlier render of this where it has got 3 new windows, but I read that and I'm like, oh, I'll have to pull that aisle roof up and delete a bit. I think it worked okay. But now, it's time for our next cathedral, please. Well, I say cathedral. It was originally the Benedictine Abbey of Gloucester and became a cathedral after its Henry VIII dissolution, and that's why it survived, and that's why I can talk about it. Now, I didn't actually end up stealing any of this. I wanted to, but, the main thing that's stopping it, obviously, it's built out of a different sort of limestone. It's a Cotswold stone from Painswick, completely different colour. It will be a lot of effort to change the colour, so I'm making more work for myself. But the clerestory windows were a lot more along the lines of what Monington had built at Glastonbury. Gloucester transepts and east arm were remodelled from 1331, making them a much more up-to-date prototype than Wells was. And they're very similar to the bits that we do have left at Glastonbury of Monington's east arm remodelling, this early perp stuff. And this would also put Glastonbury at a midpoint in this exciting early perp sequence of East End remodellings of Benedictine West Country Abbey churches, the final being Evesham in the 1390s, which, 1, there's nothing left of it, 2, I can't rebuild it because the environs of Evesham are not in GeoF 3D. The Norman church that they were remodelling here was begun in 1089 and was very different actually to the one that was at Glastonbury before the fire, because it actually had an ambulatory around the back of its apse, and you can see they do this really ambitious remodelling of canting out the east arm so that it goes out over the sides of the apse and sort of sails over it in order to make this massive east window on the end. And there's other weird things, like they have this little bridge here that maintains the access around the gallery where the gallery of the apse would have been. It's mad. Anyway. Other thing to look at though, it has no west towers. It had some sort of west block, but like a lot of, as we'll see, problems with Anglo-Norman cathedrals, they built it too quickly and it fell down, probably in 1164, and it wasn't until the 15th century they did this rather dull making do at the end, but no west towers. But the central tower, 15th century, you know, it doesn't make mine look over ambitious, I think. I was quite pleased about that. We'll see where I stole my tower from later. But you'll see a lot of the remodelling was very worried about the original tower. There's like the whole remodelling of the south transept is putting these massive buttresses in to stop it falling over. The one last thing is I would have, despite the stone problems, probably stolen the Edgar Chapel from the Lady Chapel at Gloucester. And I think that the Gaffney model does, to be honest. But I didn't notice that there was this wonderful new model in G-Earth until I was actually importing this as a comparison, because the one I had before, there was scaffolding literally all over it. So it's always updating G-Earth, and it's always, I mean, I have to keep the old versions, as we'll talk about when we get to one of the later buildings, but you can't access them in any way, so it's kind of useful that I do keep them. Anyway, can we have our next cathedral, please? And, well, what a cathedral. This is Winchester. And all I've actually taken from Winchester, and it's not really worth pointing out, but I'm going to anyway, is the east window of the Lady Chapel that projects from the 13th century retro choir. It was built under Bishop Courtenay, who was in office at Winchester from 1487 to 92. I've reduced it in size so much you can barely tell that the stone is a different colour. But it does give a great idea, bringing it in scale, to give you an idea what a seriously big Anglo-Norman build looks like. Planned out from 1079 to genuinely be one of the biggest churches in the world, equaling the length of the early 4th century St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The aisles each side of the transept, you'll see, like wells, hit really, really hard when you're building at this scale. And the sheer size of the nave, it just looks a bit low and squashed. I haven't distorted it on the Z-axis, but it would have had, or would plan to have had, a massive west block that either was abandoned or failed structurally, or probably a bit of both, so it doesn't have any west towers. And of course it has one of the most feeble central towers of any English cathedral, and that's because, remember, begun 1079, its tower collapsed in 1107, so it didn't have only a few decades up, and so after all the rebuilding they had to do in the centre of the church after they'd messed it up, they never dared bring it above this feeble little height again. So let's bring in our next cathedral, please. Peterborough. Again, what you might call a Henry VIII cathedral. It was a Benedictine abbey up until its dissolution, when it became the seat of a bishop. A later Anglo-Norman great church this, traditionally and very probably begun in 1118. But the bit that I stole is the so-called new building, which is stuck onto the back of the Romanesque apse built in the early 16th century, and that is the side walls of the Edgar Chapel. Even though it's not a similar sort of building, I've used the east wall to make the south wall and the roof, and then stuck the north wall on the side to recreate the shadows. So that works okay. The new building at Peterborough, we can date pretty accurately beyond just the abbot that paid for it, because it's built in the distinctive style of John Wastell, the master mason who completed King's College Chapel in Cambridge. The Peterborough new building is fan vaulted inside, as indeed was the Glastonbury Edgar Chapel, almost certainly because we've got fragments of conoid panelled masonry that you use to make a fan vault. The exact date where it slots into Wastell's career, well, I'm not sure if you're too bothered about the arguments, whether it's 1502 or 1509 really. The important thing to note, though, is that originally there would have been an apse at both of the ends of the aisles. You wouldn't have been able to get round the back of the apse, the main apse. It would have been outside. And that's basically the shape that the pre-1184 Glastonbury East End would have looked like, just an apse without an ambulatory behind. The doors from the cloister of my Abbey Church at Glastonbury are taken from the south side doors at Peterborough. The one where you actually do have the jambs, and I almost forgot to put them on. It would have been very embarrassing if I forgot to put doors on my building. And also the other cloister door is taken from this transept. Now, remember I said this is Benedictine Abbey, you might remember, and I'll hold my hand up here and say I don't really understand why Peterborough has this legitimate 3-storey elevation when it would have had a dormitory block. It must be that the dormitory night stair must have come out of the sort of pseudo-west aisle that it has, and that the gable of the dormitory was detached. But it's always confused me a bit, that. Anyway, comparing them, very, very low tower. It did have a little timber lantern on it that wasn't restored after J.O. Pearson had to rebuild the entire tower from the base of the crossing in the 1880s because it was so badly compromised by structural faults. Like, you couldn't fix it, you had to rebuild it. And I better not start with a disaster piece that is the west front, or we'll be here all day. But look, it does have west towers, but then they stuck another west front over the front of it. Yeah. Okay. Next. So, after we've had Winchester in, it's interesting to see a full-blown early English build with Lincoln that was begun the decade after Glastonbury in 1193. Although it wasn't this long originally, it had a wedge-shaped apse around here. Of course, I did a video about Lincoln, including all stuff like the crossing tower falling down while they were building it. You should probably just watch that. But what obviously I have stolen from this cathedral is the crossing tower, although it is a different rip. The one I've stolen is a newer rip that happens to come out that makes the stone look very much the same colour as the Dulting, but the one I've brought in is the older G-earth one that you won't be able to get anymore if you just look at G-earth, because the north side doesn't have the same gloopy, shadowy mess that the current one is. The other reason I wanted to use it for Glastonbury, other than the colours looking right, is that I didn't want to cop out and just give it a perpy tower like so many reconstructions do. Like the one in the visitor centre basically just copies Wells that was all remodelled in the mid-15th century. We do know that Glastonbury had its crossing tower and these part of the nave vaulted under Abbot Fromond, who was abbot from 1303 to 22. And then under his near successor, Abbot Sodbury, who was 23 to 34, there were 6 new bells cast for the belfry, so the upper bit with the big windows. In the Chronicle, they call it the Turra Ecclesiae, by the way. They don't call it the Crossing Tower, they just call it the Tower of the Church. Now, Lincoln's Tower is documented as being put up above high roof stage 1307 to 11. So I thought it was a decent fit for something that they could have built at Glastonbury. And then, of course, because the crossing at Glastonbury is a lot smaller, it's ended up being scaled down a lot, so it looks a lot more modest. And Lincoln did famously have a very tall spire on top, as, you know, probably about the same size as the Great Pyramid of Giza, although it's a very different thing. Tedious, really. But if there was something as ambitious as a massive timber spire at Glastonbury, we would know about it. So I didn't put anything as stupidly big on the top of it as that. Anyway, speaking of stupidly big, America! So yeah, my final source, Washington National Cathedral. So first, this is indeed inverted with all of its environs in place. Partly because I don't have a cleaned up version of this to hand and I just think it looks fun. When I bring stuff in from G-Earth, it comes out at a, I'm not going to say random, but I haven't worked it out, but it comes out at a completely different scale. I mean, this came up when I imported in that the crossing tower is as big as the whole church. It's bigger than Glastonbury Abbey, but it's not that much bigger. So you have to work out how to scale it down, and it's not the main method that I use, but you can tell when they're right, when the cars match. So that's Glastonbury Car and Park, and that's the road through Washington Cathedral Close. So, Washington Cathedral itself, quite an interesting building, thrown up in around 80 years in the 20th century. Designed by Gothic Revival stalwart George Frederick Bodley and his former apprentice Henry Vaughan, who was working in Boston at the time. And it was begun in 1907. All that was built to their design was the apse, which stood on its own for quite a while. Unfortunately here it's entirely covered in scaffolding because of the effects of the 2011 Virginia earthquake, which also on the pinnacles of the tower really shook apart a lot of its masonry. After Vaughan died in 1917, they renegotiated a contract with the firm of Philip Hubert Frohman, who dialed up the cathedral in quite a number of ways because giving it things like Western transept dials and the thing that we stole, making the west block towers the whole width of the aisle. So before, this is Bodley's design, they just went across the aisles. Now they go across the aisle chapels too. They were, although they were designed a lot earlier, begun structurally in the 1970s and topped out with the pinnacles in 1990. So that's what I've used here. What date Glastonbury's West Towers actually were does beg the question that it actually had them. As we've seen, great abbey churches didn't always have them. But I think it's beyond reasonable doubt that Glastonbury Abbey's nave had towers over the aisles. There are accounts in the early 19th century that they're getting rid of remains of western towers of gunpowder, and the archaeology of the footings of the walls of the west end of the nave do look big enough to take them. It's beyond reasonable doubt. So you've got to kind of just assume their date from the rest of the building process, because they're never directly mentioned in anything. The idea that they could have started building a west front in the early 13th century when the Galilee goes up is why I kind of like Frohman's loosey-goosey sort of 13th century stuff for the lower parts. And then the upper parts could be when the nave was completed in the mid-14th century, that you've got these more sort of late 14th century details, the sort of stuff Bodley loves on the window openings. Yeah, it's fine, you know. Of course, the Indiana limestone is a bit paler, so it does look like it's been jet washed compared to the rest of the church, but that's fine, really. The rose window is a bit silly, particularly at the scale I've got it in, because of course it's a lot smaller. Like, Washington Cathedral is just such a bigger structure over wall. You can see that its length is, if you do take the west front to the end of the Edgar Chapel, Washington is the same length, but that's the length of the high roof. And the high roof is a lot higher roof all the way through. It's a bigger building. And the fact that they can throw this up in 80 years, it's only really because they can only do it because they've got proper concrete foundations. And incidentally, when Frohman designed the West Towers to be wider, they never got round to increasing the width of the raft underneath them, and this has apparently been causing some sort of structural problems with the rest of the building that they've had to monitor there. So again, a little lesson from Anglo-Norman towers collapsing all the time. Either build slowly or build with proper foundations. Finally, somewhat of a coincidence, I discovered after pinching Frohman's towers that there is a link between Glastonbury Abbey and the National Cathedral. The bishop's seat at Washington, what we call the cathedra, utilises carved stonework from Glastonbury, donated in 1901 by Stanley Austin, who inherited the precinct estate in 1896 from his father, who had bought it in 1862. Stanley went on to sell the estate for £30,000 in 1907, a nice little earner, putting it into the ownership of the Diocese of Bath and Wells. So in this picture, taken about 1911, the cathedra is sitting in the Little Sanctuary, which is the chapel of St Albans School, before there was a cathedral to put it in. The chapel here has been expanded a lot since that picture was taken, and actually it looks like they're going to make it much larger with a crossing very soon, in fact. Have a look into that. But this is the cathedra in the cathedral itself today. Some further details about this have been published very recently, namely that there were 23 stones obtained by the first Bishop of Washington, Henry VIII Satterley, via Austin, on the advice of the Bath and Wells diocesan architect at the time. But the question appears to remain, what are the real bits in the cathedra and where are they from exactly? Well, you can see a bit better in this flash shot that there is older work set within completely new work in 1901. Very obvious. I think the real bits are only the frontal chevron pieces under the armrests, and above them these double shafts that flank the main inscription, but not the capitals of the shafts or even the necking between them. Both of these do look obviously Romanesque, the chevron, but the angle fillet in the hollow between the shafts, that's also distinctively Romanesque. But looking through loose stone reports of Glastonbury stuff, I've not found any close matches to them, or looking at photos of the standing church remains. Now, although the components I think are real are made up of multiple pieces, I can't see how they together could amount to 23. So perhaps there's some left over, perhaps some of the dressed stone in the base is from Glastonbury too. Potentially it's very interesting if anybody is visiting the mystic realm of the District of Columbia and wants to look into it further, but for now, that's as much as I'm going to say. But there you go, Glastonbury Abbey did become a bishop's seat in the end. Bishop Saverick of Bath and Glastonbury would be pleased. Hey look, that's actually a narrative for this video, hooray! But thank you if you watched all the way to the end of this. What was meant as a very quick behind the scenes video with a screen recorder actually ended up taking almost as long as this sequence did in the first place. So like, subscribe, and I actually might start another one of these with another 3D model of a lost church within G-Earth environs. Where should I do? Well, let me know in the comments and all that, but make sure the environs are available in 3D first. And you better hurry up before the big G inevitably goes and discontinues all of its Earth 3D imagery. Which I suppose would look a bit like that. Bye then!